Fundamentally, what we're trying to do is deploy every single dollar that we have in service of gender equality through multiple different spheres of influence, whether that's on the investment side or whether that's on the grant-making side. And that is the experiment.
You're listening to Let's Imagine, an Imagine Canada podcast for everyone interested in social issues and the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Bruce MacDonald. At Imagine Canada, we believe that by leveraging our national vantage point, building cross-sector relationships, and sharing and developing our knowledge base, we can advance social, economic, and environmental justice through our collective action. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that have big implications for the nonprofit and charitable sector here in Canada. A special thank you to our supporting partner, Carter's Professional Corporation. Together, let's imagine a stronger future. Right now, nonprofits and the communities they serve are navigating unprecedented challenges: rising authoritarianism, economic instability, shrinking civic spaces, climate crisis, and persistent social injustice. In these turbulent times, traditional funding approaches are being tested and often found lacking. This episode explores what happens when we shift the paradigm. We're joined by Jess Tomlin, CEO of the Equality Fund, a global leader in reimagining how resources are mobilized for social change. The Equality Fund is one of the world's largest organizations advancing human rights and justice, channeling resources and decision-making power directly to communities driving progress on the ground. Through her work, Jess shares vital lessons on how innovative funding models can build long-term resilience, prioritize trust, and strengthen sustainable systems of power, especially during times of adversity. Welcome, Jess. Glad you could join us.
I'm so happy to be here, Bruce. Thank you.
So our first question, Jess, for those who are new to the concept, what is feminist philanthropy and how does it differ from traditional philanthropy?
I know I saw this question on the sheet and I'm grappling with how to answer that question. I mean, I think we share a lot of good practices, whether it's feminist philanthropy or human rights philanthropy or proximate groups, orienting and supporting proximate groups. There are a lot of different kinds of ways in which we can call good philanthropy. Our version, we call it feminist because fundamentally feminism is about understanding the power relations that exist between people and trying to resolve and support those power relations to be more equal. And so that was why Equality Fund was born. It was born because we wanted to have a sustainable funding mechanism that would support the work of human rights movements in perpetuity, recognizing that this is a marathon and not a sprint. And we wanted there to be something that would really galvanize Canadian ingenuity and philanthropy and generosity, and that would really be that backbone and supportive mechanism to support these long-term objectives of human rights movements around the world. And we wanted the decision makers around how the money moves, how it gets invested, and how it's deployed to organizations and movements around the world. We wanted those decisions to be made, in particular by the groups who were going to be responsible for driving the change on the ground, not just within the confines of a project cycle, but over lifetimes and potentially multiple lifetimes. And I would say, finally, all of that is true. And the way in which you commit to a partner is a way in which you can also build trust. I have come from the UN system. I've come from large institutions. And what I love about what we've built at the Equality Fund is that we are here for the long term, but it's also the kind of money that we deploy that's flexible, core funding, multi-year, deeply flexible, and predictable. My ambition for the Equality Fund is that we were able to move in 10-year grant cycles, and we have been in motion now for 5 years. And the Equality Fund is a innovation, I think, for the world of philanthropy. It certainly has been an incredible experience designing and building her, I would say. And what we're here to really do is to galvanize big momentum and significant resources in order to fuel capital into the hands of leaders, movement leaders, innovators on the ground who are driving that change, and to be on the right side of that story as Canadians and as global actors. And the Equality Fund is just getting started. We've been around for just 5 years. We were initiated by a signature Canadian government investment of $300 million, which was deployed into a 100% gender lens impact investment portfolio, which I hope we can talk about. And that sense of abundance and momentum was what actually called in other philanthropic actors, large institutions like the Ford Foundation, as well as other governments and individuals who have really kind of met that call to action and have been able to really come into the Equality Fund platform. And we have moved over $100 million to 1,500 groups in 100 countries in the last 5 years.
That's amazing. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how the fund operates. It's interesting that you talked about marathoners and sprinters. I often take it a step further when we're talking about the work of our sector to say that sometimes we feel like ultra marathoners rather than sprinters because it takes place over such a long period of time.
Especially right now, when you're done the marathon and you realize you've got to swim and you forgot your swimsuit or whatever, you know?
So let's dig in a little bit more about the way the fund is unique and how it works. So, the purpose, as you've talked about, is to flow money to human rights groups around the world supporting women, girls, and trans people. And there's a long history of this type of work. And yet the model at the Equality Fund is unique. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how it works in a bit more detail and why you think this particular model is different than what we've seen out there before.
It's a great question, Bruce. And fundamentally, what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to deploy capital across the entire continuum of capital, whether that's grants dollars or whether that's investment dollars. We want to be able to use all of those dollars to their best of their potential, to their best and highest use, all in service of a common goal, which is gender equality. And so in the case of the Equality Fund, what we have done is we have, as I mentioned, we've received this signature investment that is invested 100% in a multi-asset platform for gender lens investment. We have a lot of products on the public market. We are building out products on the private market, debt, all of these types of things. And what we're trying to avoid there is to be causing harm in our investment portfolio that we are then trying to undo with a much lesser portfolio and lesser sphere of influence. And so we're really trying to leverage that influence and power that we have in the investment world to also drive change in ways that economic drivers can drive change. On the grant-making side, we deploy grants across a sphere of different kinds of organizations. What's really important to us, again, is that full ecosystem. So we do invest in hyper-local organizations. We invest in intermediaries, regional networks, policy houses, think tanks, global organizations, all of whom are driving change across a multitude of issues, whether that's democracy, whether that's climate justice, and really trying to inject resources in the full ecosystem and build connective tissue and strengthen the connective tissues of those organizations who are working at the hyper-local to the organizations that we are supporting at the global level in order for us to really build a much stronger, much more resilient power base in order to stand up to the moment in time that we're in right now. And so fundamentally, what we're trying to do is deploy every single dollar that we have in service of gender equality through multiple different spheres of influence, whether that's on the investment side or whether that's on the grant-making side. And that is the experiment. I have a lot of interest and curiosity around how successful we'll be, but the early signals are very positive. I'm very proud of this organization because we're deploying, grant-making resources into the hands of movement leaders, activists, frontline caregivers, and defenders in the Middle East, including in Gaza. But on our investment side, we are investing in, for example, portable inflatable incubators, which are being used in Gaza as they are being used in Haiti. And so, this is kind of the idea. And I think in the moment in time that we're in right now, where we're seeing a real funding cliff. I'm sure you're very much engaged in these discussions with the decline of overseas development assistance, with governments, not just the U.S., many, many others pulling back, whether for economic austerity reasons because of what's happening in the Ukraine or elsewhere. We're seeing a pulling back in government spaces. We're seeing a chilling effect in philanthropy, in particular in the U.S., because so many progressive philanthropists are under a microscope. And so we have to get really, really smart about building models that will not be vulnerable to shifts. And that has been the challenge, I think, in particular in Canada, with the way in which we fund this work, right? We're reliant on a hospitable policy environment, or we're reliant on one big gift. But what if we were just totally focused on building our own wealth that was sustainable, that was scalable, that was accountable to the movements that we are here to serve. And that is fundamentally what we're trying to do.
Yeah, it's so interesting in terms of the approach that's being taken. I think you've touched on a number of the items, but I'd love you to sort of think about these ingredients in terms of the full recipe around this issue of shifting power. I mean, we hear conversations in our sector about wanting to change the nature of the philanthropic power imbalance or relationship. So, from your perspective in the work of the Equality Fund, what does shifting power mean in real terms?
So I make no decisions. That's one place in terms of our grant making docket. Maybe I'll focus on the grant making docket because I think it's an interesting way to illustrate shifting power. At the outset, when Equality Fund was launched, we did a very broad consultative process with movement leaders throughout the world, thousands of them. They informed our process. They weighed in on the entire design of the model, including on the investment strategy. And that informed how we built the organization, who we hired, what kind of grant-making strategy we needed to have. So that was, I would say, the first thing. And we have held a measure of accountability to that initial design process. And yearly, or sometimes more often than that, we answer questions. We go into spaces where we know movements are going to be, and we have moments of radical candor around our process, our decision-making. We have a global board that was something that was built by, a participatory process. And we have built a community-informed and participatory process in all of our grant-making. And so what that means is we actually are leaning on proximate communities to inform the decision-making and make recommendations to the organization about what needs to be funded. Interestingly, we have multiple different areas that we fund and tranches, so to speak. And one of them is really an intermediary fund. So it's our way, because of our size and scale, it's our way of making sure that money is moving down to hyper-local, community-based grassroots organizations. And we fund intermediaries, women's funds, LGBTQ funds, sex worker funds, who have network reach, access, credibility with those actors to be able to deploy, smaller grants to them. Every year we go to this group and we say, here's the allocation. And this group self-selects who's in and who's out. They self-determine whether they need the money or they don't, or whether the work that they're planning to do in the year to come is actually in line with what the group has determined are the priorities and the objectives for the global effort. And I was very nervous about this, if I'm honest, Bruce, when we started, because I'm like, there's never going to be enough money. But every year they have been able to make those decisions, and they have come up with plans, and we have never had to say no at any point over the last 5 years because there wasn't enough money. And so it really is about trusting those actors, the full trust to make the decisions that are going to be in best service to the work that we all, objectively share. And so those are some of the examples of the ways in which we're shifting power, from everything from how we are designing our processes, how we design the organization, who governs the organization, how we make decisions, how transparent we are, our commitment to regular feedback and accountability, decision-making processes around grant-making and how that money being moved outside the organization to the groups who are most proximate to the issues that we're trying to work on.
So I'd like to pick up on the accountability statement that you just made. So in this almost fully distributed decision-making model, what does accountability look like? How does it unfold in this type of approach?
Yeah, I don't want to underestimate the work that Equality Fund needs to do as a bridge builder and a translator and a compliance support, right? So what we are really trying to do is, the reality is that the average annual budget of a women's rights organization globally is $20,000. So when you are an equality fund or even more so a government actor, you just do not have the skills, the staff, the compliance mechanisms, the accountability mechanisms to be able to access that funding, which is why those organizations stay small when we need them to be 10 times the size, given the scale and the impact that they have the potential to have. And so we do spend a lot of time trying to reach common ground between large funders and small organizations so that the small organizations are growing their capacity to be able to absorb more resources, and the large organizations are kind of coming to terms with the fact that they need to shift their practices if they indeed also want to shift power. So we do spend a lot of time doing that. Our due diligence efforts are both ways. Right? We work with our grantee partners and we make sure that we're making smart investments in these organizations. We moved 1,500 grants in the last 5 years in over 100 countries, including some very fragile contexts, right? We do a ton of translation, and that is the work of a Global North organization who has that access and can walk in the front door and to be able to really expand the pie and think about ways in which we can be debunking some of these assumptions and myths around these Global South organizations who just have simply not the size or the access. So we spend a lot of time doing that. We have our own due diligence processes, and that is just as much about, existing capacity of those organizations as it is about their ability to really fulfill their mandates given the realities in which they face, oftentimes in war, conflict, humanitarian settings, whatever. And it's always a bit of a dance, but we're sort of on the dance floor trying to figure it out, because otherwise there's just going to continue to be this massive delta between the work happening on the ground and the way in which the money is currently moving.
Well, and it's interesting, too, if we even think about a domestic context as it relates to changes to qualifying disbursement rules that were made a few years ago. And are there learnings from this approach that can be applied, yes, globally and internationally, but also here at home? Because presumably some of the changes to the way dollars were hoped to flow would mean that more organizations who are smaller would started to be access the presumed new dollars that were entering the system. And I think there's probably some great insights from the work that you're doing to help navigate funders who are trying to understand how to make those changes.
Yeah, I think one of the things that surprised us the most about becoming the Equality Fund, and there is a podcast on becoming the Equality Fund, I should plug, was how much space and platform we were given in order to bring new folks together who had never been in the room together. And so we are having conversations around the role of women's rights organizations in humanitarian crises. And because of our funding landscape, we're able to bring in tremendous leaders from Sudan and from Afghanistan and from the Middle East. And we're also able to bring real policy leaders inside governments who are trying to kind of shape foreign policies and international development policies, and frankly, institutional investors who are very curious about this work, as well as philanthropists who are sort of seeing the writing on the wall and want to be at a more crowded table, right? Where they're not just moving money, but they're leveraging their philanthropic dollars for a greater, higher impact result, recognizing that they have a very specific role to play. And so it has been a delight, actually, to realize that we have some convening power. And those conversations have unlocked what we believe to be hundreds of millions of dollars, not for us, but for our movement in which we are accountable for. And when we designed Equality Fund, we sort of saw three key pillars for our work. One was moving the money out the door, one was raising money for our movements, and one was building out a really sophisticated, human rights-oriented, gender lens investment portfolio. And now we're seeing actually that we can be a convener of policy influence. And that has been a really interesting thing that has emerged in our early days.
So, Jess, it's been great to hear about some of the, in a sense, high-level changes or fundamentally different approaches that are being taken. Are you able to give us an example of where on the ground, like a story or an example of how you're seeing this unfold differently?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think one of the things that's on my mind the most is Sudan. It is a forgotten crisis, and yet it is one of the world's worst humanitarian crises we've seen in this century. And so one of the things the Equality Fund does is work with a kind of constellation of other funders to support grassroots movements, leaders, policymakers, lawyers who are doing their best to support, in particular, girls and women who are both fleeing and staying in Sudan. And in the last year or so, we've been able to move about 10 million, and that has specifically been flexible funding in a very volatile region for organizations who are working in very micro contexts to support democracy, who are working to build shelter systems in order to discreetly protect girls when they are vulnerable for sexual violence, who are retraining boys and men who have been brought into the military or who have been brought into various forms of violence. There are folks who are reimagining economies, who are thinking about what is a post-conflict, what does a post-war Sudan look like. And it is the influx of resources into all of these various types of things that I think are just building more cohesiveness and connective tissue so that movement, which is largely led by women in Sudan, is really starting to feel like they can begin to imagine a future without violence, which I would say is not perhaps immediate, but it is in the longer term. We are working in 61 countries fighting for democracy and women's political participation, supporting women political leaders who have progressive agendas, who are trying to do really important things in their countries, whether that's municipally at the city level or at the country level. We're working in 38 countries to support land defenders and Indigenous women in particular, who are really working at the intersection of climate change, including bringing into the conversation at national levels the Indigenous ways of knowing. So much of that knowledge is kept by women. And we're funding about 1,000 organizations who are working in particular on this hot button issue right now. I don't know why we're still here, but on the sexual health and reproductive rights issues, as well as gender-based violence. And these two issues just really are foundational to they just stand in the way of our true equality, right? As women and trans folks. And so in spite of it all, these organizations work on so many issues, but there is not one who doesn't tackle violence. And until we resolve violence as a systemic societal issue, then we can't get to the other stuff. And then some of the, I would say, more nuanced things like supporting organizations and movement leaders who are trying to defend their democracies. There's been a cohort of organizations that we're funding in 35 countries that are really trying to bring about policy changes, including having more women represented in politics, having more women elected, having more democratic processes. And there's about 8,000 activists, in fact, that we were able to support gather just on this issue alone this year.
Yeah, these are some really interesting insights that are being unearthed here. So maybe I want to just talk a little bit about some of this work around human rights. And, you mentioned at the outset about the Equality Fund emphasizing long-term unrestricted, I think you said 10-year funding. Why does this kind of support matter so much for advancing human rights? And from your perspective, why is it even more vital during a time of crisis?
I fundamentally believe that people-powered movements are the only thing that has ever brought about deep, lasting change. We see this in a variety of spheres, but the idea that, for example, you look at the racial justice movement, civil rights movement, we're not where we need to be, but that fight is centuries old. Are we making progress? Yes. Does it feel like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or 3 steps back? Absolutely. But it is this constant holding ground, breaking ground tension that we're holding, and it needs to be done over decades. And I think we as folks who work in this sector need to be at peace with the fact that the work that we're committed to just might not be realized in our lifetime. And so we ground ourselves in that a lot at the Equality Fund. That's really important. And just we fully recognize that change doesn't happen in project cycles. I mean, we would like to be funding in 10-year cycles. I would love to be funding in generational cycles, because that truly is the arc of change. And maybe one day we'll get there. But incremental change is happening, and it's happening all the time. And then these sort of snapbacks happen. And so you have got to be there as a funder, right? You've got to be right in there. And they need to know that the last thing that they need to worry about is whether they can meet payroll, when all of a sudden they have to completely pivot their strategies because there's a real threat to the safety of women or whatever the issue is that they're grappling with. I not so long ago sat to the latter half of your question, why now? I mean, why now? How many times are we asking ourselves that question in one day? But I had the privilege of sitting with a gentleman named Marshall Gantz. who's recently released a book I think it's called People, Power, Movements. And he said something to me that like really stuck with me. He said the last 20 years or so have been tremendous for mobilizing and organizing. We've seen so many folks actually in protest. We've seen millions of people in the streets, whether that was because of Black Lives Matter, or whether that was because of Me Too, or whether that was because of the divestment movement that we started to see, and many, many more. So folks just got really mobilized and motivated to move. And Marshall Gantz has been part of movement building for a very long time. He was part of like the Chavez Farm Workers Union. He ran the ground game for Barack Obama in his first presidential election. And he said that the issue is what we didn't do is we didn't leverage all that movement, that momentum, that protest. We didn't build anything. We didn't build anything with all of that money and movement. And that was an uncomfortable thing to hear. Upon reflection, I believe it's part of the problem right now, right? Because we did not build unflappable democratic institutions or institutions that were going to, no matter what, fund human rights and be untouchable, right? And so that's, I think, what we are trying to do now. We're trying to be an untouchable financial arm of the women's movement, the feminist movement, that will be there no matter what, and that is not vulnerable to policy whims or philanthropic shifts or more devastating things, right? We are kind of built for this moment. And I would like for us to be building other things. The Equality Fund is a micro example of what's possible, right? And in order for us not to come back to this moment that we're in right now, we're going to need those unshakable, unflappable, unvulnerable institutions that are going to protect human rights and democracy.
And I might add, especially at a time when democracy itself seems under attack around the world. So I'd like to pick up on one comment you made about sort of funders have to kind of be in it, like they actually have to be in it, but maybe take it in a particular way with a question. It's sort of a paradox or a tension that maybe some funders feel. So how does the Equality Fund navigate the balance between being a funding institution and being an active ally to human rights movements, especially when they might face backlash or kind of shrinking civic spaces?
Yeah, it is I mean, we're talking about dancing a lot, Bruce. I think after this, you and I should go dancing. I don't know.
Just
It's
wear like really steel-toed shoes if you're dancing with me.
I will. I'm sure I have a pair of Doc Martens from my high school days in my closet somewhere. It's a really good question. We think about it a lot, and we think about it both in terms of how we can cause harm and how we can be supportive and protective, right? And certainly, there are organizations that we fund who will not publicly disclose that they receive support from us because it actually causes them harm. It brings more attention to their work, particularly if they're working in an authoritarian context. Knowing that they're receiving human rights funding is really deeply problematic for them. It's why we also fund underground groups, non-registered groups. That's our work to do. Right? It's our work to rationalize that to our funders. It's our work to understand what a new form of accounting looks like. That is our job to do. And we're very, very committed to doing that. And we have a whole cohort of unregistered groups who just cannot take the risk, but deeply require the discrete support. And then there are times when actually we can be really helpful and we can leverage our platform, our access, in order to really bring issues up. And so I've talked a little bit about our convening power, but there's a question that sits inside the Equality Fund, like who needs to be at this table? Who is missing at this table? And when we find ourselves at new tables or tables with decision makers and policy makers or influential funders, we often ask ourselves who else needs to be here. And we see ourselves as like somebody who can kind of open the door. And oftentimes, in particular, I would say we fund a broad range of organizations and partners, everything from service delivery for underground battered women's shelters to policy think tanks and research institutes. So not everybody needs the same thing from us. But there are times when our particular political, social, geographical capital is useful. and they will leverage that and access it. And that has unlocked all sorts of things: new funding, new policy relationships, influence into emerging policy dialogues, new research bodies that will support that work. And we also build connections with like the diplomatic community in country, with a number of the activists and movement leaders who haven't otherwise had access. And that in part is because the voices of feminists and human rights defenders is so, so critical to any diplomatic effort, particularly those of the Canadians and the UK and other governments that we're working with.
Yeah, this is like absolutely. I'm sure we could go on forever, quite frankly, but we've got just a
But
couple
we're
of
going
questions.
dancing, so we can.
That's right. So just a couple of questions, and I like to kind of pick up on the theme that you talked about in terms of like this idea of supporting almost underground movements, if you will. I mean, certainly some of the places around the globe that you're working with, you might classify as having more extreme conditions than what we face here in Canada, and yet there's lots of parts of our country that need to change and evolve. So there's this idea that global movements can offer powerful models of resilience and resistance. And so, what lessons can nonprofit leaders and funders here in Canada take from these movements around the world that are really leaning in and leading boldly in the face of real significant adversity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say this moment that we're in is not in particular with our northern gaze, right? It's not new. There are so many important examples to glean from how movements have stood up to powerful political movements, who have stood up and defeated authoritarian regimes. There are so many incredible case studies, in particular of Global South movement leaders who have done this over decades, and we should be leaning in and listening and learning here, because there are some incredibly powerful examples. I know we are, as the Equality Fund, we're really connecting with so many of our partners to better understand how to situate ourselves in this moment where we have to be careful in ways that we haven't had to be careful before. The other piece that I would say is that my board chair, Theo Sowa, who's an incredible leader on the African continent and globally, she reminds me that civil society is going to exist whether you fund it or not. And anybody who's grown up in a feminist household and has sat around her mom's kitchen table knows that to be true. There will always be a way, because this is people's lives, and we have to trust that people will want to make lives better for their children. And so our role, organizations, formal organizations, many of them are going to go right now. Many of them are going to merge. There's going to be a whole process of germination and renewal, and there's also going to be a lot of tragic closures. And I'm not denying that institutionally this is going to be difficult, but the act of grassroots organizing will happen no matter what, whether the funders are there or not. So knowing that to be true, what is the best possible leverage a funder can bring into these spaces? Those are the questions that we are asking ourselves.
Well, it's interesting when I hear the quote from the comment from your board chair. It strikes me that it's a different interpretation of what civil society means. Rather than civil society being defined as registered corporations, it's defined as people who care, and that they can be expressed through registered corporations and the formal civil society structures that we see. So, Jess, I'm going to close with the final question, which is the one we ask all of our guests, which is around, as you look at the work that you do, the work of the Equality Fund, and the state of things today, what gives you hope for the future?
I mean, there's actually a lot of things that give me hope. I said it earlier, Bruce, I don't want to undermine or underestimate the tragedy that is befalling us in this moment, and the ways in which this will impact millions of people's lives. Just the funding scarcity and the lack of support and the borders closing and the lack of attention to diversity and the lack of attention to human rights and the moving away from some of this and the snapback that feels is hitting us in the face. And the current system wasn't working. And to actually be given the opportunity not just to be able to fix it with a Band-Aid, but to completely imagine new possibilities only happens when you are a phoenix rising from the ashes, which is very much the Equality Fund story, actually. I've witnessed firsthand how you can build back completely differently when you are boundless. And I trust the creativity, the ingenuity, the perseverance that exists in our movements to build back differently. And I'm excited about the creativity and the possibility. And I see it happening cross-generationally. I don't want to do that to our young people, where what you won't hear me say is like, young people. Because young people need some help, y'all. They are inheriting a big mess. But to be able to finally work together across generations and frankly across genders in ways that we have not really been able to do as yet is just like unlocking so much tremendous potential. And so that's what's giving me energy and so therefore giving me hope.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear about the work that has happened in just 5 years. I, for one, am so interested to watch the next 5 years and beyond of this work to see the transformation that it will be making. So, Jess, thank you so much for taking time out of your very, very busy schedule to join us here on Let's Imagine.
Oh, it was my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Let's Imagine podcast. For full show notes and to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an episode, please visit our website, www.imaginecanada.ca. Also, if you really like this episode, we invite you to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast, as this helps other people discover us and engage in these conversations. And again, thanks to our sponsor, Carter's Professional Corporation, for supporting our podcast.